Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the introductions here. Uh, First of all, thank you all for joining us. And I'm happy to introduce Dr. Norman Farb today. This is going to be the beginning of a series of once every 2 to 3 week mindfulness science keynotes that we'll be hosting over the next few months, and hope you can join for those that you find interesting. Dr. Farb is really one of the leaders in the understanding of the neural correlates to engaging with mindfulness practice, and one of the researchers to really help put on the map the central importance to the interoceptive brain networks as related to mindfulness practice. He'll be speaking with us about some of that work and other of his work today. But just to give him a little bit of his academic background, he did a joint bachelor's degree in psychology and philosophy at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And then for graduate school, studied affective neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto with Professor Adam Anderson. His thesis was appropriate for somebody with a background in both psychology and philosophy, to which of thine selves be true. Changes in viscerosomatic neural activity with mindfulness meditation training reflect improved present moment self-awareness. And after his graduate work, did 2 postdocs before starting as faculty. First at the Rotman Research Institute with Dr. Tiffany Chow, studying resting state networks and their differentiation in dementia. And then back at the University of Toronto on personality and brain projectors of happiness with Professor Will Cunningham, with whom he also did some mindfulness-related work. These days, he continues to expand his research interests and also is focusing on developing practical and fun tasks that can assess capacities related both to effective emotion regulation and distinguishing between pleasure and meaning as sources of motivation. So without further ado, thank you very much once again, Norm, for being with us today, and looking forward to your talk.
Great, thanks so much, Charles. And thank you everyone who's come and volunteered your time to be online for yet more of your life. And I'll try to make it worth your while as best I can. My understanding is we have about the better part of an hour to go through some slides, and I'll try to share some ideas. But if something really jumps out at you and you have a question and I can notice it in time, we can always do a little back and forth during the talk. But I think the way it's intended to go is I'll try to lecture for until we get a bit closer to 3, and then we'll do some question and answer. And there's time that spills past 3 into up to 3:30, I think is like the, 4:30 my time, or 1:30 Pacific time will be the final end of the question Q&A. Right. So I'm going to do the first big hurdle. Well, the first big hurdle is getting my children to leave me alone for this talk. But the second big hurdle will be sharing my screen. So I'm going to try that now. And you should hopefully see some PowerPoint. That's right. I guess just try to run the PowerPoint. Okay, thanks for the thumbs up. And I think in this mode, it's a bit hard for me to see questions, so I might need a bit of moderator help if there's something going wrong that I need to pay attention to. Otherwise, I'm going to just sort of move forward.
We will take care of that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so great. So I'm really excited to be here. And again, thank you so much for coming. Today, I'm going to talk about this idea of what's in a breath. Right? And in a more sort of formal, nerdy way, what does it mean to cultivate body awareness through the breath, and why is that an important aspect of mindfulness training? And I'm going to try to jump around to a few different domains of inquiry and sort of trying to map the space out in this area. So hopefully you'll enjoy the ride. So we know that the breath is really central in a lot of meditative and contemplative traditions. We know it's central to mindfulness traditions. If you do even like a novice glance at the early instruction texts around mindfulness meditation or Buddhist style meditations in general, you'll see a lot of instruction that begins with the breath, right? So like one of the canonical instructions for the beginning meditator, the beginning monk, is just to notice if the breath is long when it's long, and notice if the breath is short when it's short. And while the noticing and the awareness is really important, I don't think we want to look past the fact that the initial vehicle for training is paying attention to the breath. And I think that's true even in contemporary, both religious and secular applications of mindfulness. You can see quotes from like Thich Nhat Hanh saying, breathing in, I calm my body, breathing out, I smile, dwelling in the present moment, the only moment. So the breath becomes this kind of anchor to the present moment. So even if you don't necessarily need to become allied with a sort of soteriological project, like this sort of project where you're going to enlighten yourself or save yourself from being reincarnated, to have some sort of instruction that the breath will immediately have some inherent benefits in anchoring us to the present, and maybe also doing some other things like calming us down or helping us to smile or something like that. And if you want to go more secular and look at a John Kabat-Zinn quote, have this idea of as you begin befriending your breath, so getting to know the breath, building awareness of the breath, we start to see immediately the presence of unawareness everywhere. So insight shows up when we start paying attention to our breath. So this isn't just a rote practice to sort of cow you into discipline in some monastic setting. It's supposed to have a lot of meaningfulness and value to it. Great. So then I would expect, based on some of these things and the centrality of the breath, that breath research is really like a foundational cornerstone of contemplative science. But if you go onto something like Google Scholar and you search for mindfulness, and then you start searching for mindfulness in conjunction with terms like breath or respiration, something really interesting shows up. So there are now 553,000 hits on Google Scholar for mindfulness. Not all of those are full research papers, but it gives you just a sense of the scope. But if you search for mindful breathing, mindful breath, mindful respiration, you can see a startlingly, at least to me, small percentage of studies actually feature these terms. They don't have to necessarily be in the title to show up. They're just not really featured terms in most articles, right? So in some ways, mindfulness research hasn't really befriended the breath as a focal point of investigation, right? Not enough that it shows up as a hit on a Google Scholar search. And I think there's a couple reasons for this, right? It's not that mindfulness researchers don't understand how central the breath is to a lot of the actual practices, but it also kind of shows us there's a lot of work to do. Like I toyed with the idea of showing, a kid alone at his birthday party, but now everyone's having their birthday party alone, and I was afraid it would be like too triggering and all that stuff. But there, I've spoken into existence anyway. But there aren't a lot of people really focusing specifically on the breath, and maybe part of that is that we don't have as well developed a science of inquiry around the breath to begin with. If you do a comparable Google Scholar search for the 5 external senses and how many hits you get compared to respiration or the breath, or interoception, which is the science of the body's internal state, or the idea of the signal of the body's internal state being represented in the brain, you get a really similar picture, right? So there's a lot of people doing things on vision, touch, taste, hearing, smell. People turn their nose up relatively a little bit, pun intended. But then body awareness interoception is, again, like the thinnest wedge possible in a pie chart, showing that really we don't actually have a lot of methods for studying the breath that are easily applicable. Whereas if you wanted to study, what happens when you meditate and how does that affect attention? There's a lot of attention tasks probably derived by people studying, things like vision or hearing, or you want to study what is the consequence for mindfulness training on well-being? Well, there's a lot of investment in clinical assessments. There's a lot of studies with those outcome variables. But I feel a little bit like the science, and it's understandably so, has moved towards trying to look for your keys like under the street light, right? Because like we're looking for the places where we already have like nice methods that we can apply. And it's understandably so, because you want to use validated methods when you're studying something maybe out there a little bit, right? Or a little bit outside of people's common experience. You don't want to have two moving parts where you have, you know, an experimental measure and you have an experimental construct that people don't really know much about. And so if you don't find something, or even if you do, you don't really know what's driving the boat there. And at the same time, it's a little bit disheartening that we're not getting right into the primary constructs that people are meeting with their experience and their practice, right? Like people aren't thinking about their Beck Depression Inventory score, like or their ability to like rapidly move their eyes back and forth on a screen when they're doing their practices. And so maybe we're missing something by not really focusing too much in the breath. And so this presentation in some ways also, if you're thinking about like, what could I do with some of my research or a fledgling researcher, I think there's a lot of room at this empty birthday party right now to be a body awareness interoception researcher, full stop, and even more room at the table if you want to be a contemplative scientist studying things like body awareness and interoception. We know that there's like this carrot at the end that would drive us to want to understand the mechanisms of mindfulness training. And I probably don't have to talk too much to most of you about that carrot. I'm just going to highlight some of the greatest hits, right? So like a dispassionate meta-analysis in JAMA Internal Medicine showing that mindfulness, which is really a breath and body awareness based practice in almost all of the practices, does seem to have this kind of carrot of, you know, you'll get to improve mental health. You might help reduce your sense of burnout, which now more than ever, I think seems like a really important sort of capacity to develop. And maybe even there's like broader, big picture meaning in life things that come out of mindfulness. And my colleague, Eric Garland, spearheaded the development of this mindfulness to meaning theory, talking about how people might actually learn to change the narratives about their whole lives. Like your whole meaning of life could shift through these sort of concrete practices of attending to the sensory landscape of the breath and the body. And so that's the why bother kind of part of asking what's in a breath. Like, shouldn't we really get to know one of the primary vehicles that's supposed to drive us to these amazing destinations? And I know I'd argue yes, and I think hopefully I can share some of my own excitement and my colleagues' excitement about the work we're doing, and help get the ball rolling a bit more in the next few minutes. But before I do that, I thought maybe we'll do a little experiential check-in. I talked about all of these sort of conceptual outcomes and the problems around it, but the first way that we can really get to know more about the breath and what's in a breath is just through our own experience. So if you don't like doing meditation, or you don't want to go into your body at all, that's fine. Just bear with me for 30 seconds. But for everyone who's willing, maybe you can just spend like 30 seconds just coming into contact with their breath right now. So finding some aspect of your breathing that you can be aware of right here and right now. Something that you can sense directly. It could be the surface of the lips or nostrils, feeling the air pass across them, or a change in temperature in the back of the throat on an inhalation or exhalation. It could be the musculature, the rib cage, the belly expanding on the inhalation or contracting on the exhalation. You can notice that the breath kind of does it itself if you just watch, but it's also really easy to tweak it and push it around. Maybe if you closed your eyes and started meditating on the breath, already your breath got tweaked, got slower and deeper. Or if you're feeling a bit anxious and you don't like all this stuff, but you're trying it anyway, maybe your breath's getting faster. So there's already a ton of information available to us without fancy slideshows, and for sure without an MRI or anything like that, where we could start to get into what it means to breathe, and not just to breathe because we're doing that already, but to pay attention to the breath and try to use that as a scaffold from which to cultivate other capacities. We know that there's a lot that's supposed to come out of our breathing. There's this idea that we're cultivating the primary qualities that we would need to be a mindful person, right? So we're learning to set intentions around where we want our mind to go, and then we're learning to attend to what's actually happening and have some awareness. And we might learn to model different attitudes and see whether that helps us stick with our intention or subverts our attention because it makes us too upset or think about something else, or so on and so forth. We can see emerging research that just playing with this relationship with the breath is likely to create a feeling of relaxation, unless it triggers some other conditioned response. So it brings up either conditioning, or maybe we learn to skillfully move into a lower state of arousal and can relax ourselves. There's some really fascinating research coming out of Fadil Zaidan's lab showing that slow breathing has profound analgesic effects. So it might help us to tolerate pain and actually have less of suffering from pain. And then there's these like sort of downstream effects that are promised across both religious and secular literatures, that we're going to start noticing things, right? We're going to start noticing like our feeling states. We're going to start noticing how we react to those feeling states and get a sense of our mental habits. And maybe we'll start noticing things about the fundamental nature of reality if we really go down that rabbit hole. But it all just starts with that sort of simple but kind of radical act of shifting back to just the feeling of breathing right now and asking ourselves, what's that like? What's familiar? What's unfamiliar? What's changing? What's the same? And then everything kind of can unfold from there. So I'm just sort of like taking you through this garden path meandering of some of the philosophy and importance of the breath, and also some of the research that might motivate this kind of inquiry. So if you're with me so far, you might ask, okay, that's cool. But why do we really need to do all of this stuff, right? Like, yeah, I could also be working on pumping up my bicep. I could be working on making sure I have really well-groomed hair, which I clearly don't. I could be doing all kinds of other things that are demanding of my attention. So why is this something that's important to work on? Why is it important for me to cultivate the ability to stay with the sensory experience? Why is it important for me to represent my breath fully and as completely as I can inside my mind and have it activating these sort of sensory pathways in my brain? Why do we need all this? Well, I'll suggest that we might consider what the alternative is when we don't do this. So I'm going to reuse a couple of cartoons I used in a talk a few weeks ago. So apologize if you're a double attendee. But there's this meme, right? This little doggy having a coffee in a burning building and saying this is fine. And so the alternative, is the sort of status quo, right? Which is that we have a life that's mostly on autopilot. And it's on autopilot in the sense that it's not really attuned to sensation, right? So autopilot is in a way senseless because it's about already knowing what's going on and reacting accordingly. So the status quo that I'm going to try to push forward that we're in a lot of time is just like doing what we got to do, and we kind of just need to orient quickly to what the situation is and then respond and then move on to the next thing. And we might be missing out on other salient indicators of either danger or benefit that we really should be attending to. So the alternative, and this is the part of the meme that often doesn't get shown, is that we might actually have this kind of magic moment where we're on autopilot and then we really wake up that something important is happening. We sense from our proximal, like momentary experience, that something unexpected but important is happening. And from that, the world transforms. In this case, the world transforms from the worse in terms of like, I'm realizing I'm sitting somewhere that's on fire. But what, if you don't notice it, what will happen, right? So sometimes we're waking up to unpleasant things, and sometimes we might be waking up to really pleasant things. But it's an alternative to just assuming that things are just supposed to go on the way they are, right? And that our main job is just to like push down uncertainty, push down unexpected events, and sort of act like we know and be like responsible adults and be in control all the time. So we have these kind of two tensions at play, and paying attention to the breath is an alternative to what I'm going to suggest the status quo is, right? And we can see this play out a lot in some of the most recent theory on how the brain might be wired and what motivates us to do really anything in life, which is this idea that we're always pitting what we know about the world already, our expectations about the world, against incoming information. And what we see is somewhere in between that, right? So what we simulate about our reality is kind of a blend of what is coming in from the world right now, which could be the world inside our bodies as well, against what we already expect to happen. And when our expectations, our prior knowledge is violated, that's where motivation comes from. And so the hypothesis that I'm working with as researchers really interested in well-being and how people either transform their lives for the better or the worse, is working hypothesis that what's absolutely critical is to be able to balance between these two things, right? Not to demonize like conceptual knowledge or things that we've learned about the world. Those are hard-fought pearls of wisdom in many cases, but also not to valorize it to the point that we think we know it all already, and we then lose the ability to detect change. And we know neurally that there's really good evidence for systems that are supporting these two poles of human experience, the stability kind of pole and the change sensitivity kind of pole. So in the brain, prior knowledge we think might be represented by this kind of default network, right? And I know I'm sort of cartoonizing the brain, and of course everything works together and talks to itself, talks to all parts of the brain, talk to each other. But we know that when we think about things we know the most about, like our knowledge about ourselves, or we develop a habit, so I'm doing some new task and I just get used to running on autopilot on that task, that this cortical midline part of the brain will light up. And it's no accident that it's kind of along this midline here. It probably is evolved, this is slightly speculative, from just having to automate a lot of our physiological functions, but probably now we're automating a lot of cognitive functions now that those are things that our brains do as well, and that we're much more complex organisms. And we have this network that's supposed to keep things going the way that's expected, right? And as our knowledge of this network has expanded, we know that it has different subcomponents, and some of the things that we're trying to keep as expected are probably the meaning structures in our brain, the semantic layers, right? So it's not just about that I'm going to perform the action the way I know how. It's not just about knowing that I press the stop pedal on my car will stop my car automatically, but I also know what things mean automatically. I know what I should be remembering or thinking about automatically. So our whole worldview is sort of subserved by a network that's supposed to promote a sense of prior knowledge that makes good predictions about how to respond in the future. So that's really important to have. And we have a pretty good characterization of some of the brain systems that help that occur. But the flip side is that we also need to be open to change from time to time, like when things light on fire. And so it's important to have representation of chaotic sensory information and to be able to integrate that information into our experience in some way. And we know that the brain also has really well specified sensory cortices, probably the most stereotyped parts of our brains. Like the parts of our brains are universally the same almost across 99.9% of the population are the sensory cortices. Like vision is always processed in the back of the brain. What's happening on the surface of your body is always processed in this kind of hairband that runs right around where my headphone band is here in the somatosensory cortex. You have audition by the ear, like hearing. And if we go in past the ear in the somatosensory hairband, just inside, we actually get representation of the body's internal state in places like the insula. And so we definitely have the architecture to detect things changing. A lot of the brain is dedicated to only doing this, right? Even though there's these other places that are going to do planning and more higher cognition or support habit, like the default network, there's a lot of hardware for sensation. And so we can actually see if we ask people in the scanner, for instance, to sit in their prior knowledge about themselves, or to notice in the moment the sort of chaotic flux of thoughts and feelings and body sensations, that people can preferentially activate these networks, right? And sort of my first claim to fame paper was to show that with a bit of mindfulness training, you get better at toggling between these networks, right? So on the left-hand side here, the default network activating when people make me, not me judgments about the self internally, and then try to explain and rationalize and sort of fall into their well-rehearsed narratives about themselves. And on the right side, a bunch of sensory areas like somatosensory association cortex, that kind of hairband is what I talked about, in the insula, for what's happening on the surface of the body, or the insula, what's happening viscerally inside the body, turns on when people try to notice who they are here in the moment. Like, what am I feeling right now? What am I physically feeling? What am I viscerally feeling? What kind of thoughts are popping into my head? We start seeing a different kind of network turn on. So we know that this is kind of within reach for people to switch between these modes of processing, and with some expertise, we get a little bit better at it. And critically, the training vehicle that lets people step out of the default, which of being in the default mode a lot of the time, is to go sensory. And the breath is like the primary target for going sensory, in addition to also doing body scans. So moving from place to place within the body, but you kind of have to go to pick a place in the body to feel the breath anyway. So I think they're kind of the same kind. And the reason why this is so important, I think, because why wouldn't we just be able to use this capacity without any sort of training, comes from a second sort of line of research that's deeply informed by my colleague and mentor, Zindel Siegel, which shows that when people get stressed, our brains get pushed into this automatic form of processing. And so if you look at these kind of blue lines, and this is sort of like information coming up through the brainstem, through the spinal cord to the sensory cortices, somatosensory cortex sliding forwards towards the prefrontal cortex in a sort of blue shaded region. What happens when we get sort of stressed is we get all this sort of cognitive elaboration along the midline, which is sort of red highlighted areas of the brain. And that has a kind of unintended consequence then of pushing back and blunting our ability to take in more sensory information. It's like akin, if we want to anthropomorphize the brain, to saying like, I'm busy solving a problem right now, I don't want to hear any more about it. Or even if it's like a scary problem, like I've got it already, like stop telling me more about this problem. I need to stay away from it in order to solve it. And if that's really what's happening when we're at our most vulnerable, when we're stressed or feeling overwhelmed or most challenged, there might be some unintended consequences of leaning heavily into this prior network instead of the sensory change affording network. And we've been able to show this in different ways. So one way we can show this actually playing out in the brain, because it's just like an interesting idea so far, is we show people sad film clips compared to neutral film clips when they're in the scanner. So doing fMRI scans, they're watching like really sad scenes of a parent saying goodbye to their kid because they have cancer, for instance. And we have like a neutral baseline of like home and garden television, which for most people is not hugely emotionally evocative. And we look at what the brain on sadness looks like with or without meditation training. And we get a lot of those kind of cortical midline activation that we expected, but the highlight of this 2010 paper that really blew our minds was that we were also getting a ton of inhibition along the somatosensory cortex in the insula here, which is circled in yellow, and some of the attentional control regions of the brain were turning off, right? So this idea of you start getting emotionally disturbed by something, and not voluntarily and maybe unconsciously, sensory information is getting inhibited. And the more people inhibit sensory information, the more depressed they are. Right? So these are people with mindfulness training who are in blue dots, without mindfulness training who are waitlisted and who are in red dots. And you can see that as you get more insula suppression, so moving below the dotted line in response to sad film clips, the higher the Beck Depression Inventory score is, the further right they go on this sort of x-axis of depression symptoms. So even though it might seem like a logical strategy that I'm going to just like focus in and use all my advanced cognitive architecture to solve this emotional problem, by not allowing new information to come in, we in some ways are precluding the possibility of realizing that the problem of feeling bad has been resolved. Because like, where is that information that our feelings have changed going to come from if we're just always ruminating, thinking about the problem of feeling bad? And so we kind of talked about this as maybe explaining even why people become more and more vulnerable to depression once they've had an episode of major depression in their past, right? You have all these positive and negative events, these kind of bubbles here. But over time, when we get stressed, we start fixating on those negative events, not because we like them, but because we're sure that like our mental machinery, our cognitive machinery is going to solve them. And over time, they get really deeply associated together, so that any new, this is sort of the bigger bubbles here on the far right, negative events trigger those past events and spiral us back into all of these negative associations. And if you take that a step further, you can see that now we're kind of having trouble seeing other positive events because we're so good at linking together the negative events. And so when we go sensory, what we're doing is trying to like push back against that packaging together of negative events in this hyper efficient meaning representation, and forcing in the inclusion of inconsistent positive events, right? And it might be other new negative events, might be neutral events, but we're just forcing our minds to open up and include representation in a deeper than just like surface sensory way, but in sort of integrate other types of novel information. And if we can do that, we can change the packaged set of events that we hold together and get activated really easily, which is sort of where our sense of meaning, like our life story, our context comes from. So this idea, this ability to transform ourselves by moving into a sensory domain where we can take in new information. And so this moves from a story of like why people become depressed again into a story about how mindfulness training can lead to meaning by using sensory attention to broaden an already learned narrowing of attention to focus on well-rehearsed past events, which often tend to be stressors and negative evaluations. So you might say, oh, that's a cool story you just told, person whose career is somewhat invested in talking about the importance of interoception. Can you show me more evidence that goes beyond like studies a decade that are now a decade old? And it's taken a long time, but unfortunately, I think now starting to be able to. So if you're saying kind of like, oh, I see a question pop up. Oh, I don't know if a recording will be available afterwards, but it is being recorded, but I'll leave that at the host's discretion. Hopefully, I'm fine with it. So if you're saying, what you talking about, Willis, which again is dating me as a speaker, I'm going to show you some evidence that we've been working on over the past decade or so. And again, this is work that it wouldn't be possible without colleagues Indil Siegel. And we ran a really large study of looking at why people relapse in depression. And we scanned people who were recently remitted from depression. So now they are no longer depressed. They no longer have like a ton of depressive symptoms. They're feeling okay, but we know they're at a heightened risk in the future of becoming depressed again compared to the general population. And we scanned them after we knew that they were sort of stably remitted, they're doing okay. And we had them do either cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And we scanned them again afterwards. And then we followed them for 2 years to see who would relapse. And in the scanner, we did a few different things, but today I'm going to focus on the paradigm I already discussed, which is showing people these sad film clips in the scanner compared to neutral film clips. So what is it about their emotional reactions that predict who's going to become depressed or not before and after therapy, where the kind of gold standard of like something bad happening is they experience a relapse or recurrence of depression over the next 2 years of follow-up. And what we're able to find, and this is study under review right now, though I think now you're not supposed to say where it's under review. I signed an agreement saying not to, so it's under review somewhere. That shows that when you expose people to sad film clips, you get a massive and profound deactivation of a lot of the sensory cortices. So that's the blue here in panel A. And you get a lot of activation in the prefrontal cortex, which are sort of the red areas, and also a couple of fun hubs of the default network and the temporal parietal junction, those little side ears of orange there as well. The more residual symptoms people have after they recover from depression, because they might still not feel the best after they recover from depression, they're just no longer at that clinical threshold, the more you see deactivation in the somatosensory cortex and insula. So that replicates the 2010 paper. That's this sort of panel B here, showing the areas that are associated with symptom burden. So the higher depressive symptoms, again, the more you shut down somatosensory and viscerosomatic processing, the feeling of what's happening on the surface of your body and inside your body, if I'm going to read the tea leaves of what this brain activation probably means. And I should note that because it's primary sensory representation cortex, I think it is safer to read the tea leaves in reverse and for what an activation or deactivation means than some association area that means something different for each person, right? Everyone represents their bodies in these parts of the brain, as far as I know. You can see from the bar plots that people who will go on to relapse tend to deactivate a bit more. And this is just looking across all of the somatosensory regions, which is this huge cluster. I'm going to get into that a bit further. And here's just showing the scatter plot with depression symptom burden. Regardless of whether you're a relapser or remitter, you get this kind of negative relationship. So this inhibitory relationship between what's happening in the brain and how depressed you are at the time of scanning. If we then look at what the predictors of relapse are, so we say, okay, now we can code each person for did they relapse or not, just like a 1 or a 0 over the 2 years, and put that onto these reactivity maps. We see two kind of patterns. The first pattern is that bilaterally in the somatosensory cortex and in a supplementary motor area, we have a pattern where the more people deactivate in response to sad film clips, so 0, where there's no change, is really at the top of panel B here. The more people deactivate And everyone deactivates. I shouldn't say a little bit. It's not like this is something that only sick people do, but the people who deactivate to an extreme amount relative to their peers who stay healthy are the ones who relapse. And unfortunately, this is not something actually that changes with treatment. This is like baked deeply in, that some people are going to be more sensorily avoidant or be more prone to inhibiting sensation when they're stressed than others. And 8 weeks at least of treatment, and I'll talk a little bit at the end. I'm happy to even chat about it in the Q&A. I'm not saying that it can never be resolved, but 8 weeks of treatment is not actually resolving this biomarker. And I call it a biomarker because you can predict, I think the number is 87.5% accuracy over 85 people who's going to relapse and who's not. And both the sensitivity and specificity are in the 80s. So it's actually starting to, like, you can tell more than 4 or 5 times right who's going to relapse or not based on whether they deactivate. I should also mention, just in context, that about 20%, 22% of the sample relapse. So it is a bit skewed in terms of who's a relapser, who's not, but it's not just like 2 people out of the 85, right? It's in the 20s. It's not all irresolvable, and psychotherapy I think does work. That's part of why we're doing the study. We actually were doing the study to dissociate between MBCT, like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and cognitive therapy. Didn't get much out of there, but we do find places that are responsive to therapy in general, regardless of which therapy it was. And here's, just as a survival plot showing you that if they hadn't had any therapy, they would probably be relapsing around 50% of the time, because most of the people in the study have 3, 4, or more episodes of past depression, so they're highly recurrent. But even though as a group they're protected, like only 20% of people are relapsing, there's a big difference between the inhibitors in terms of how quickly they tend to relapse over the follow-up versus those with low inhibition, right? Only maybe 10% of the people who are in the lower half of the inhibitors are relapsing. Probably 40% by the end of the 2 years are relapsing if they're a high inhibitor. This is a survival plot for those who like those sort of Cox models. But there's also parts that are responsive to therapy, right? So in panel B here, I'm actually showing how the left prefrontal cortex here is becoming less reactive with training. So this is a different score from post-intervention to pre-intervention. So the people who learn to not activate their prefrontal cortex as much, it looks like a deactivation here, but it's actually moving from a heightened activity down to not so reactive. So they're not activating the prefrontal cortex as much when they're exposed to a stressor, also tend to relapse less, right? Compared to people who don't show much change. 0 is the dark colored in line here. And the dotted line here, I should just say, is the optimal cutoff point for making that classification. And again, you can get pretty good prediction, not quite as good as with the static marker, but still in the 70s. For predicting who's going to relapse and who's not. And this is an independent marker of relapse. You can put in the same model with the static somatic inhibition marker and get additional predictive power with this. So you can push around at least like how much you react with the thinking, conscious awareness, planning side of your brain with therapy. But after 8 weeks, you're probably not touching that more deep-seated level of turning off the brain. And how these two patterns are kind of related is I took the seed region in the somatosensory cortex here, the peak region here, and looked at how connectivity with this region changes as a function of becoming sad. So that's a psychophysiological interaction analysis, if you want to hear lots of syllables to say that a different way. And I looked at where changes in connectivity with the somatosensory regions predicted relapse. And what I was able to show is that not the left lateral prefrontal cortex, but the same region on the right-hand side was driving the sensory inhibition. So when people become sad, the connectivity score, the correlation between what's happening in the front of the brain and the sensing parts of the brain, the somatosensory cortex, becomes negative when people become sad. But it becomes particularly more negative in people who end up relapsing. So the people who end up relapsing are using their prefrontal activation at the same time as they're inhibiting somatosensory processing even more than the people who stay healthy. And we know, hopefully at least, that we can target some of the activity in the prefrontal cortex. It would have been beautiful if it was both on the left side or both on the right side, but they're homologous regions. They probably have some crosstalk, and there's some hope there that eventually maybe you can get at the more chronic indicators of sensory avoidance that are predicting relapse. So just to summarize that, I know it was a ton, and I'm a bit cruel because I'm going to do that to you a couple more times, but maybe not as complicated a results breakdown. But to summarize that, we see that there's scars of stress-evoked sensory inhibition that predict people's risk of becoming clinically depressed, at least in a sample of people who have a history of depression. So there's some heightened vulnerability there. And 8 weeks of cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy seems to reduce prefrontal hyperreactivity to mood challenge. But it doesn't seem to be enough time for us to see changes in sensory inhibition. And we know, though, that what joins these together is this idea that stress-evoked prefrontal activation tends to inhibit sensory activity, at least in terms of the functional connectivity relationship. So just to get back to this question of like, what's in a breath? Well, if there's a way to undo this pattern, that would be really important. And we could try to undo it by telling someone like, stop inhibiting your sensory processing by just talking to them a lot. But you could also just have them learn to cultivate awareness of the sensory processes that you think are being inhibited. And how might you do that? Well, you might turn attention towards those sensory qualities that are immediately available, like the breath. Right? So how does breath awareness help us break free? Well, maybe it stops like this seemingly automatic and stable evaluation in the face of emotional stress. I see something popping up. I can't read it right now. Okay, my apologies. Now, a problem with trying to do this in a practical, like not in the scanner sort of way, is that it's hard for us to really know whether what people's level of body awareness is. I think we actually don't have great tools for measuring things like interoception yet. And I think a lot of people, my colleagues in the field, would agree. And it's even worse when you're trying to measure awareness of the breath. And you would want to kind of have some measurement of this if you want to be able to help train people, or if you want people to be able to assess, like, is my personal like idiosyncratic problem a lack of interoceptive awareness? Because this is probably just one of a panoply of factors that are going to determine mental health. So it would be great to have a tool for that that's not just based on self-report, though self-report gets us part of the way there, because we're talking about self-report on awareness, and we want to be able to detect when people don't have awareness. And so how do you answer something where you don't even know whether you're aware or not? It gets a bit fraught, though it does definitely have some value to just talk to people and ask them. And you can see changes in subjective self-report with things like mindfulness training, affecting body awareness on scales like the MAIA, the multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness, put forward by Wolf Mailing and colleagues. But if we want to get into like something more quantifiable and something that we could like get ready to get someone to do in a scanner or something like that, to get more at mechanisms, we really don't have that much out there. The dominant paradigm for measuring people's body awareness is heartbeat detection, which I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about now. It's enough to say it's not the breath, and there might be other issues with heartbeat detection. There are new measures coming out that get more at breath awareness. You can look at having people breathe through a tube and blocking the tube a little bit with like filters or stoppers, and seeing if they can notice, like, is it getting easier or harder to look at like loaded respiration. You could play back to someone their breathing rate and ask them, like, is this the rate that you're breathing or not? And so these are some kind of interesting paradigms that have come out in the past 10 years. But I think it's worth stepping back instead of just, again, looking under like where the street light is like what's already there, and thinking about like, what are we really going to try to measure if we want to have a useful measure of breath awareness. And, you know, I go back to, well, let's start with like where all this started. Like, can a person notice when their breath is long compared to when their breath is short? Because that's what they're being asked to do in like most in the canonical texts. Right? Someone's asking me if I can restate what sensory inhibition is. Sensory inhibition is turning off the tap of oxygen, right? And the ability to turn on like that part of the brain that represents what's happening in the sensory domain, right? So sensory inhibition would be like, in order for me to see something, part of my brain has to activate for me to see something right now, right? If I'm going to smell something, it's because part of my brain got activated when the right molecule bound with my receptor and way up my nose. So sensory inhibition is saying like, you can bind whatever you want, but the part of the brain that's going to activate to let you know that something was detected isn't going to turn on as much. It might even, it's turning off relative to business as usual. Hopefully that is helpful. So we might want to start, if we're making a tool, with actually trying to like engage with what we think people are training to do. And so I want to talk about just a task quickly. I know time is starting to get short, so maybe we won't go through all the examples of it, but we have a couple different flavors of a task that we've been working with in our lab, and it's really painfully simple. Hopefully, hopefully you'll find it too. So one thing you can ask people to do is just to breathe along with the circle on a screen. So you can try it with me now. When the circle gets bigger, you can breathe in. When the circle gets smaller, you can breathe out. So we're yoking breathing to an external stimulus. You might say, oh, that's not pure interoception, it's visual. Yeah, you're right. It does have a visual component that drives it, but got to start somewhere, because there's a lot of cool things we can do once we have people breathing along with the circle. So one thing that we can do that's really interesting behaviorally is we can actually manipulate your awareness of your physiology and change your physiology at the same time. So if you're willing to do it with me, I'm going to start the circle moving again. And I want you to try to figure out, as you're breathing along with the circle, whether or not your breathing is speeding up or not. Okay, so breathe along with the circle, and after 6 pulses, I think I set it up to be, you can tell me whether your breathing sped up or not. Okay, so let's try that now. So I'm not sure if I can just do a straw poll or anything, so I won't try because I don't have enough time. But there, halfway through, to me, it felt like things sped up a lot. And that's on purpose, because what I did was I made the circle speed up by about a third, like 33%, between after the first 3 breaths, and as soon as the 4th breath started, it sped up a lot. So that would be a situation where I think people probably would notice their breath speeding up. And that, of course, the more you speed up, the more likely they are to notice. But there's something else we can do. And so I want you to try one more time to do this. So this will be version 2. And try to notice whether the breathing is changing or not. So this time, the breathing sped up the same amount. It sped up 33%, but I amortized how much it sped up across every single pulse. So it's like the frog in the pot kind of thing, that I turn up the heat slowly, and it's harder to notice. And it may or may not have been for you in this PowerPoint caricature of the study, but we're starting to have really good data, and this is work doing with the graduate student Kyle Logie, to show that as you move people's respiration away from no change, which would be right in the middle of these graphs at the 0, towards an extreme speed up, which are the negative numbers, or a slowdown, which is a positive number. This is a proportion change, like multiply, you breathe 12 breaths a minute, subtract minus 0.65 times of that at the extreme. We can actually manipulate whether people notice their breathing changing or not based on whether we very gradually change it, or whether we change it all at once between 2 consecutive breaths. And so by doing this, we can actually start to look at, like, first of all, at what level do people start detecting changes? But then also, at a fixed level of breathing for that person, what does it mean to have awareness of the breath changing versus not awareness of the breath changing? Like at minus 0.5 here, the breath is speeding up by 50%, but we can control the probability that you notice that or not. And a 3 alternative force choice test, it's speed up, slow down, or no change. And when we do that, we find something really fascinating. There's a bunch of cool things in this study. This is also something we're just getting ready to submit. I'm happy to talk about more details later. But one really cool thing that comes out of it is, at least for these kind of speed up trials, people only start to say that they actually feel more excited, like physiologically aroused, or that their mood is lifting, that their mood is changing, when they accurately detect that their breathing has changed. When their breathing changes by the exact same amount over like a minute of following these circles, but they don't detect the change, they don't report any changes in mood. They don't report changes in physiological arousal. And then there's interesting consequences of that later on that I don't have time to talk about right now. But one thing we're getting just from a behavioral study of pushing people's breathing rates around with or without their awareness is that noticing whether the breath is long or the breath is short is the doorway to noticing that other things might be changing. We're showing that behaviorally. Like, these people know nothing about meditation. These are like the same, 20-year-old undergrads who are coming in to do just an experiment for course credit, or now we're getting a web version that's almost ready to go. So we can look at people like on MTurk or Prolific or other online communities. And if you really want to have transfer of just like a physiological state to introduce change in like a cognitive appraisal state, you need to have awareness. And awareness of the breath is sufficient to leverage some of that. But it's not, of course, the only way you could change your mood, right? And the opposite is, if you aren't aware of the changing in your breathing, there's no effect on how you feel in your overall mood state. Of course, there's boundary conditions. If someone breathes slowly enough or fast enough, like they'll get hyperventilated, pass out, or something like that. But within, the normal range of breathing variation, it doesn't change your story about yourself, right? So you have to notice a sensory change. A sensory change in some way precedes the qualitative subjective appraisal about well-being or mood or energy level or so on or so forth. And the cool thing about a paradigm like this is we can also put it in this scanner. And then that's the last thing I'm probably going to show before I wrap up, as promised, so don't go over an hour and we can get more into Q&A. So we can take a task just like this. I'm not even going to talk about the speed up, fast, or slow. I'm just going to talk about breathing along with the circle in the scanner, as opposed to just following the circle and not breathing along with it. And we can see that you're following along with it when you're breathing along, because you'll actually breathe along, and we can see if the respiration belt in the scanner is matching what the circle is doing. But we can also have you press a button when you're breathing in and breathing out along with the circle. And as a control condition, we can have you press a button as the circle gets bigger or smaller, but told like you don't have to breathe along with it, just focus on the visual information. That's all we care about as a control condition. And by doing that, we can look at what happens in a really well kind of controlled way. We have nice behavioral data and feedback. What happens when people are attending to the breath as the source of their behavioral response, like these key presses, getting bigger, getting smaller, breathing in, breathing out, compared to just vision alone. We can also test that they're not just spontaneously entraining to the breath in the vision condition. They do a little bit after trials, but we can sort of control for that. This is a study that I did with Cynthia Price. She's developed mindfulness-based touch therapy. There are training effects that we looked at, but I don't have time to go into today. I just want to focus on this main aim of what happens when you start paying attention to your breath, and then what happens if you subjectively report really feeling the breath, like and having a good relationship with what's happening in your body, which is like going to be indexed by these Maya scores. Okay, so 2 questions. What happens when I turn from external to internal? And then a follow-up question. What happens if you, with individual differences in subjective interoception as you move from external to internal? So if we have this task, we show people in the scanner, we say like breathe along with the circle. Sometimes you do it passively. I'm not going to talk about that too much today because it doesn't work as well. Or actively, so you actually have to press a button as the circle gets bigger or smaller, or breathe in and press a button as the circle gets bigger and smaller. And what we find is when people pay attention to their breathing, the prefrontal cortex shuts off. It shuts off despite the fact the circle's moving in both conditions. It shuts off despite the fact that you're pressing buttons that match the circle moving in both conditions, and the circle's moving at the same rate in both conditions. There's something special, and I'm going to direct your attention to the second clump of bar graphs here, which is people doing active interoception, button pressing while they're doing interoception, that turns off the prefrontal cortex in ways that not being engaged and being told to focus on the breath doesn't, which is passive interoception, or either active or passive exteroception, when you're paying attention to the circle with or without key presses, doesn't turn off the prefrontal cortex the way this does. This is like a family-wise error, less than 0.01 corrected effect over 44 scans of people in this mindfulness-based touch therapy study. So there's this profound deactivation effect from attending to the breath. What's the role of expertise here? Like, how does this co-vary with Maya scores? Is it just quieting the brain? Put zippers on the brain there, on its brain mouth. Well, we have this deactivation effect. And we also know that when you do something like mindfulness-based touch therapy, your interoception scores tend to go up at post-intervention. They go up more than if you just get tested a second time. And regardless, we have a nice spread of individual differences in Maya scores now, so we can see how that affects that deactivation. And what we see is that this pattern of deactivation has a covariate with Maya scores right along the anterior cingulate that opposes the deactivation. Right? So the higher your Maya scores, the more it looks like you don't deactivate just along this anterior cingulate subset of the prefrontal cortex when you're attending to your breath, even though a lot of the rest of the brain, the front of the brain, is quieting down. So what's in a breath from a neuroscience perspective might be a general quieting. And at the same time, with expertise, or maybe it's just by genetics, whatever it is, you happen to have a good relationship with your breathing, you report high subjective awareness of the breath, So with higher subjective awareness, at least, which could be driven by expertise, you filter out that deactivation to still spare some of this monitoring that we know that happens along the anterior cingulate cortex. So we can turn off the brain generally to selectively turn on and have better signal on very particular aspects of our experience. And maybe that's one of the first kind of things we're learning to do when we learn to concentrate in meditation, right? When we learn to cut in touch with something that's normally overridden by all the other noise in the brain and all the other things going on outside us in the world. So there's a quieting, but also an opening to only invited guests in that sort of quieting when we attend to the breath. And that could be a skill that might be transferable, right? I can turn away from things in general and then open up to things selectively as I want to explore and try to understand them. That might actually be really foundational for insight, though I don't have that step in this neuroengineering paradigm to talk about right now. So we're just coming up on an hour. So I wanted to conclude here, and then I've got lots of other things we could talk about. I'm happy to hear your questions and see where we go. But I wanted to just reaffirm that, like, the breath is the core of a lot of mindfulness practices. It's woefully understudied compared to like what mindfulness buys us, for instance, or what we can show on conventional tools that were never designed to interrogate interoceptive experience or a contemplative practice. But we could generate tools without being really complicated and clunky about it if we really just think about what it is we want to measure. And once we start to do that behaviorally, we might see, for instance, that awareness of changing sensation is the gateway to changing in broader appraisals, which I tried to show some of the behavioral data, countering the sort of harmful habit, this deeply ingrained habit of avoiding taking sensory information when we get stressed. And we can actually become experts for ourselves in our practice, and maybe we'll see the science sort of help substantiate this over the next few years as these papers come out and more research comes into the field, of selectively re-engaging with parts of our experience that might be adaptive or lead to insight, by at the same time having this tension of being able to quiet the mind, but keep the door open for these sort of valued types of experiences that could be the impetus for deeper change. So I know that was a ton of information. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I really have to acknowledge my mentors, Adam Anderson, my graduate advisor, who's grant writing, helped fund the project that I talked about with Zindel, who's been with me all through grad school till this very day. Cynthia, who helped with the mindfulness-based touch therapy a study that we're still working on. And then Kyle Logie, who helped with the behavioral interoception paper, and all the members of my lab and the funding agencies. And of course, thank you so much for attending. And I'd love to chat and hear more about your responses, because this was a very one-sided presentation so far. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Norm. Very interesting talk. And we have a few questions that have come in already. I will say, for those who may be needing to leave right away, just again, thank you for joining us. We'll have our next speaker, Dr. Linda Carlson, in 2 weeks. If you haven't received the information about that via our listserv, you can go to our website, mindfulscience.usc.edu, and sign up for the listserv, and also see the details on that talk as well as other future talks. And looking forward to continuing this exploration of mindfulness within the USC community and beyond. So, getting on to the more interesting part here, some back and forth. I do have the capacity to turn on people's ability to speak, so we can have some back and forth from participants who've already had questions. I did have one question I wanted to start off with, which is
moderator's prerogative. Yeah.
Moderator's prerogative. Please allow me. I won't monopolize the time, but I do have one that I just was curious, and the absence of your information on this topic might indicate that there was no difference. But this one of the studies under review currently, the comparison of the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to it sounded like it was a cognitive therapy with a wellness focus. Is that how you described it?
Yeah, like the Fava tradition. Yeah, so it still has some experiential stuff like savoring and trying to come into contact with pleasure, but it's thought records and fear hierarchies and all that stuff too. Yeah.
And it was another 8-week intervention.
Yeah, pretty closely matched in terms of structure. Yeah. Yeah.
And just to kind of solidify my understanding of what that study involved. Did it involve doing the pre and post neuroimaging with the evoked STAT emotions from the film, immediately pre and post the intervention, and then just following for the 2 years, but not doing another follow-up 2 years later of the neuroimaging? That's the basic model.
That's the basic model. We actually did find some money to invite people and permission to invite people back for third scans, and we actually have probably about 40-ish third scans. We're just not there in the analysis yet. Right. So I'm really interested to see if that, so like those static markers unlock after 2 years. Because we see, I don't have time to talk about it in this talk, but we have some papers published in Journal of Clinical and Consulting Psychology that people continue to develop skills like decentering and distress tolerance over the 2 years to the extent that they keep practicing. So they might have had therapy acquired skills that later unlock those things, but within the 8-week just pre-post training period, we don't see them unlocking. And then if you're getting at the question of, do we find differences between the therapies? Not in this film's task. We have some other tasks like a self-reference task and reward processing task where things might show up. And there's also another paper that is probably going to come soon on just like resting state connectivity, where there might be some differences. But just in terms of like the initial response to sad mood, we don't see differences. And trust me, like we really try to find them. Like we p-hack that data and it's just not there. Yeah.
And the psychological assessments you did, other than depression relapse, did you also get measures of things like mindfulness and or other Maya, and were there differences in the groups there?
Yeah, resist the urge to try to find another slide and burn all our time. We had a bit of a kitchen sink approach with like emotion regulation, mindfulness, like self-compassion, things like that. And we ended up this is in a published paper already from last year in JCCP, where Zindel is the first author. And we found that there's kind of 3 factors across that unite all of these different measures. One is residual symptoms, which like most people know is a good predictor. Like if you don't fully recover, you're at risk in the future. That actually doesn't change much in the intervention or follow-up period, because they've already just had an intervention that got them down to a residual symptom level. So we explain it. But the other 2 factors are, as I mentioned, like a metacognitive awareness or decentering, which unites a bunch of the awareness subscales. And it also loads highly with positive affect. So it's kind of like a benevolent attention factor that continues to grow. And the final of the 3 factors is a distress tolerance factor. So it's like the absence of rumination or dysphoric attitudes, plus like the presence of acceptance. The most acceptance scales are measured negative wording anyway. And that one also tends to grow, but its slope of growth does not significantly predict protection from relapse in the same way that the slope of growth for this metacognitive awareness or decentering factor does. So they're very close. Like we're talking about one side of the p-value versus the other. So we have these 2 different sort of things moving hand in hand, is the ability to like be kind with yourself and pay attention, and the ability to accept when the things you find with your attention aren't nice, like that sort of distress tolerance. And those things tend to continue to develop, especially in people who don't relapse. So we see that, but they don't have obvious neural correlates in this paradigm in the way that residual symptoms do. Yeah.
Got it. So the bottom line, yes, there's certainly some differences that you were able to observe between the 2 groups in some kind of core and targeted aspects of psychological function related to mindfulness, but it didn't have an effect that was observable in depressive relapse.
Maybe there's differences in between relapsers and non-relapsers, but they didn't distinguish the 2 forms of training. Like I would have thought for sure body awareness would go up more in MBCT than in the cognitive therapy, but maybe because there's a savoring component, maybe they were too closely matched. I don't know, but we don't see, they seem like common, like trans therapeutic factors, protective factors. Yeah.
Okay, so that, sorry, but maybe I didn't catch it. Were there any mindfulness specific therapeutic protective factors, or did you only end up finding these trans therapeutic ones?
Not with the approach we used. Yeah, we did separate factor analysis in each group. We still get those 3 factors, and we don't see differences between them. Yeah, one way is there's invariance in measurement, like in the correlations between everything. But in another way, if you're trying to find like what's different, not so much. Like part of it is also that a third of people in each group aren't responding; they're relapsing. And so, I can't, I think like, what if we could have taken those third of people and moved them into the other group? Like maybe it's watering down some of the effects that people who are getting something out of the group are benefiting, but we're missing people who don't get it from that sort of access point. So maybe we're talking about the same kind of process, but some people get it through sensory exploration and through these sort of practices, and that's where the insights come from. And in a cognitive therapy, maybe they're getting it through more like awareness of thoughts, right? It might still be an awareness like generation process. It should be, right? If you think of like the psychotherapy theory, but we're not sensitive to that. And when we look at just the general response to like negative emotion, we don't see that they're processing emotion in a totally different way. There might be some stuff coming out of the connectivity paper, but I'm still working with another graduate student to finish that one off.
Great. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up to a few additional questions that have come in. Thank you for that exploration. I'm going to start with Mara Mather, who has brought up 2 separate questions here. Let me see if I can just. Mara, are you able to?
Kid Commando crawling over to his laptop over here.
To speak now?
I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
Yeah.
So you answered one already. Thank you. But the other one was, I was wondering whether you think breath is something special physiologically, or whether it is just sort of, this happy accident that it's something that's both automatic, changing, and also accessible to consciousness. Or is there something about attending to the breath that really would be different than if we attended to the heartbeat or to skin sensation or other interoceptive sensations? Is there some interactive process? Like, does it typically slow down breathing, which would then have its own set of physiological effects? Or do you think, in other words, do you think it's just like breath is a particularly nice thing to latch onto just because of its features? Or do you think there's something that is multiplicative in terms of attending to the breath?
Yeah, it's an awesome question. I mean, that's like the heart of a lot of the stuff that I think about. So thank you so much for bringing it up. I think it's both, right? So I think if I'm going to stick to my guns, any sort of sensory exploration is going to give you some of this this leverage. It's going to pull us. If the problem is habit and sensory cortices can be activated in a relatively like unconditioned or deconditioning way or an extinguishing way, you should be able to get some of these benefits by visual, through the visual pathway, right? And I think this is sort of that it's just a matter of giving people the right access point kind of argument, right? Maybe some people have a really great ability to observe their own thoughts. And even that is like a subvocalized simulation of speech inside the brain, and they're engaging in like a simulated sensory process, right? Or you go out into nature and you just take in everything, and maybe you're not even that aware of what's happening in your body, but you're just taking in all the sensory information outside, or you have this experience of awe, right? Where you see something that's just like so much different, bigger and different than you, that it really just changes how you think about things. So these are all just access points to breaking out of the conditioned pattern of perception and appraisal. And yes, they should still be beneficial, and it might be a matter of finding the right fit with the person, as opposed to saying breath is the best. And there is something special about the breath that you don't get from these other sensory modalities. People do tend, even without training, to slow down a little bit when you get them to focus on their breathing. There's some evidence to suggest that the more they meditate, the more they slow down, which is actually a problem for neuroimaging research. In our study, we tried to control for that, because even in the untrained people were slowing down from like 17 breaths a minute to 16 or 18 to 17, like a small change. But we tried to control it on multiple levels analysis. But you can push around your physiological arousal, which they're trying to argue with the behavioral task, by breathing, right? Like it's immediate feedback into the source of like your feeling signals. And there's something really rich there. And if you slow down your breathing, you engage parasympathetic networks by breathing out longer than you breathe in is one of the sort of folk wisdoms around that. You will probably experience relief, like actually sensory relief from pain, not just like affective relief from pain. You will feel pain less, is some of the stuff that Fidel is starting to show. I think it's both. I think it's not just a happy accident that people gravitated toward the breath historically, and I don't think it's the exclusive modality by which we can have a lot of these sensory benefits. And so if you're someone and I didn't have really a chance to talk about this, but if there's like a trauma event that's deeply conditioned to the feeling of breathing, for instance, despite these relaxation benefits that are there in general for the breath, it would not be skillful to force someone to do the breath because, like Norm said in a talk, it was the best, or like it was in this, in Anapanasati, it is in some sutra that was the best. You might as well find a sensory access point that is a safe place for that person to work with. But eventually there might actually be added value to using the breath that you wouldn't get out of just visual processing, for instance.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I'm going to bring up also a question from Rishi Singh. Let me enable your audio there, Rishi.
Well, hello, guys. What an awesome conversation. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you great.
And mind you, I am also a Canadian from Toronto, so I'm like really glad you're representing T-Dot out there. So, my question was actually in regards to, wondering like if people's personality traits, if there was like this, their recovery rates were kind of associated with personality traits, because, I wonder if like that also plays a factor when you're doing this research.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's too controversial to say that we have a great personality indicator of all psychopathology, which is neuroticism, or now it's called negative emotional reactivity. And residual symptoms like that factor is like one of the primary loaders onto that factor. If you use personality is neuroticism. Neuroticism by itself will. And now I know Big Five got rebranded, so it's negative emotional reactivity is what it's now called. But it's a tendency to get freaked out by things, right? It's a tendency for things to unsettle you. So that would be like the go-to answer, I'd say, if you're asking about personality. And then, of course, just like these sort of static brain markers, it's really hard to change those like enduring traits. Maybe some of it is genetically endowed or baked in at such an early age that it would be, you'd have to scrape off so many layers of conditioning that maybe it might approach impossibility. So that's the number one thing I would look at if you're thinking about personality is like, are you the kind of person who gets upset easily, right? Do things people say bother you? Do you get annoyed easily by things around you? That's not necessarily, I haven't seen a lot of evidence showing that neuroticism goes down when people meditate, and it becomes chicken and egg too. If I'm a really neurotic person, maybe I seek out meditation because I'm so neurotic, and then hopefully it like helps assuage that concern a bit too. Most of the evidence around these like transformational practices is more around like constructs like openness to experience. And again, that's chicken and egg. Like I'm the kind of person who's willing to try things, and I open up my mind even more, and it becomes a sort of positive reinforcement cycle. And then, mindfulness can sometimes be looked at as a dispositional trait, or these factors we're talking about. Like, so the trait that we have evidence that protects you against relapse is this ability to develop. We've vacillated between metacognitive awareness and decentering. We even had a grad student focus group where we showed them the items and asked them what to call it. And so it just depends who your audience is, right? Like if it's a cognitive therapy audience, I would definitely call it like cognitive diffusion or decentering. If it was a mindfulness audience, I call it mindfulness. If it was like a science audience, I call it metacognitive awareness or meta-awareness. The more that grows, the more able people are to deal with the slings and arrows of the day-to-day, it seems like. And it definitely is something that can grow in a way that it's very hard to push down neuroticism, but this feeling like I'm the kind of person who values understanding what's happening inside my own mind, that's the quality that practice reinforces and seems to continue to go up over time.
great. We have a question from Stacy Bliss.
I'm not sure if she's here to ask it again, but I can read it. Oh, hi. Here.
I'm here. Hi. Yeah, you mentioned that the prefrontal cortex quiets or shuts off. And I'm just wondering, maybe I missed it, which parts of the brain are highlighted when you ask them to focus on the breath and or push the button?
Yeah, great question. Most of the evidence of things turning on in this, like, I would argue, like, better controlled paradigm is pretty weak. Like, at the thresholds that I would want to publish the rest of the data at, I can't find things actually turning on. It is almost completely a quieting. If you have less well controlled studies where, like, you're not matching exactly what's happening, so papers in 2013 looking at this where it was like words on a screen compared to the breath, then you start to see activations in the posterior kind of cingulate, which is like a default mode network hub, but also feeding forward into the posterior insula. And there is some suggestion that greater expertise lets that signal propagate forward towards the anterior insula and prefrontal cortex more. But it's not so easy when you exactly control for behavior and for like what's happening on the screen to see those activations. It really seems mostly like a quieting. Now, of course, like, some area must be becoming more active, it feels like, right? If you're starting to have an awareness of something that wasn't there before. But what the Maya covariate information kind of shows is this information was already being represented continuously, and it was more that there's too much else going on to notice it. So it's not so much that you start to activate representation of the breath. The brain is extremely interested in representing the breath all the time, because if it doesn't do a good job of it, you will die. Like, it's one of those things. It's not like you missed some visual thing in your periphery. It's like you will not breathe at the right rate to have the right oxygen level, and something really bad will happen. It seems like the brain is always doing that. And what changes with attention and awareness is how much that information is allowed to propagate forward to the prefrontal cortex. And we've shown this in a few different papers. You see greater connectivity, for instance, from the posterior insula to the prefrontal cortex in people with meditation training, where you see in this study I just showed that the deactivation spares aspects of the anterior cingulate, which is like a hub of the salience network, like the noticing, motivationally relevant information network, to the extent that people are reporting more awareness as they engage in this process. So I'm starting to think like you're not going to see an area light up that wasn't already lighting up before. It's already lit up just to keep us alive. And whether that information actually gets to hit a place that becomes reportable or accessible to consciousness is the game that we're playing, not that we're going to turn on a region that wasn't on before. Right? The third eye opening, or whatever, if you want to take that like kind of metaphor, is just looking inwards at a signal that we've learned to ignore over decades, because it's just not that important for most of the things we do. Or that's at least what we've been taught.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I will just mention one thing. You can tell me if it seems relevant to your answer at all. Mm-hmm. You and others have reported that engaging with breath-focused mindful awareness seems to engage some of the frontal parietal attention network subsystems, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in particular, as a kind of marker of maybe some enhanced selective control after engaging over time. And that's a little bit less of a kind of immediate impact of focusing on the breath as much as an impact of kind of sustained practice. But it does seem like it could be related to where the question was coming from. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm sure the attentional set, like how you're organizing what information gets to be processed at a deeper level, like, is reconfiguring when you attend to the breath. But I wouldn't look at I guess I wouldn't look at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activating and being like, oh, that must be breath awareness. It just means like, oh, they're up to something, right? Like, and then what that means is, like, you could look at the connectivity to the prefrontal, the DLPFC, or the connectivity to the anterior cingulate to get a sense of like, well, what information is being prioritized right now that activation is like a little alarm signal, like, yep, we're prioritizing something. And then you want to see like, okay, so what information is flowing to it? But yeah, that's a good point. There are things that do get activated. They're just not primary sensory regions.
And we had some question from Brandon here. Let's see, is Brandon still with us? Okay. Brandon?
Hello?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. So my name is Brandon, first year PhD student, and I'm actually working on delivering mindfulness-based interventions through robots, specifically respiration based ones. So I feel like a lot of the times when we hear about mindfulness-based interventions and respiration ones, there's little specificity in the actual intervention. I was wondering what you think is like a good mindfulness-based intervention, assuming that we kind of have some kind of feedback of someone's breath. Like, should we, if they're breathing like shallow, should we like kind of extend it, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question, really rich. And it gets a little bit back, I think, to Mara's question about like, is there something special about the breath? And I'll try to elaborate on what I mean by that. So it really depends what you're meditating for, what you're doing your mindfulness intervention for. And I think there's a bit of a hubris, I would say, in teaching meditation sometimes to think that it's all about deep insight. And so you'll hear the classic thing that always like pissed me off as a student and still kind of bugs me is someone will be like, I did this breathing exercise and I got so relaxed and it helped me fall asleep and helped me deal with my insomnia. And then the teacher who's been taught to say this says, well, mindfulness is not about falling asleep. It's about falling awake. So then you kind of like devalue the person telling you like, I got something out of it. We have some research that's under review. Everything's under review or about to be submitted, but talking about how people have really different motivations in these courses. And I think it's important to characterize that before you try to think about what's optimal, right? Like what's the goal? Okay, then this is optimal practice. So if you're trying to learn, for instance, to tolerate ambiguity and to be with not knowing and to maybe like notice your own reactive habits to being in that situation, I would argue you would want someone to try not to change the breath at all. Right? You want them to have as much contact with the breath as they can and then have it be kind of chaotic or unpredictable and just have this be like an awareness building practice. But that's a very different goal than someone who comes in who's super stressed and is like desperate for like a physiological relaxation response, or someone who's hyper aroused in the evenings and can't sleep and is trying to get better sleep quality. It might be that those insights help get them there, but probably the fastest way to get there is to help them relax. And as I mentioned, like, and it sounds like you probably already know, giving people feedback on their breathing and helping them modify their breathing patterns and then sort of check, like, did that make you feel more relaxed? Did that help out? Do you feel like calmer now or better in some way? Might be the way to go. But that actually would be antithetical to how most mindfulness courses are taught. So you're not going to say, I taught mindfulness-based stress reduction if you're teaching people how to get their breath to really slow down. Right? That's against the kind of spirit of these, and these are manualized courses, I would say. Like, so if you look up the mindfulness-based stress reduction manual, you can download the PDF for free, for instance. I think Saki Centrelli is like the primary author on it. And there are very specific things that you are supposed to do, but none of them are telling people the breath should look this way. In fact, you're trying to pull people out of a prior's kind of framework into let it be random, let it be unexpected. And like, you're trying to like reward them, like as a teacher for grappling with that. And like, there could be a ton of other stuff you could look at that would help in terms of structured breathing. I'm not sure if you read the literature on like holotropic breath work is a pretty large and growing field of directed paced breathing, and it's trying to get a science base around it that's supposed to produce particular physiological outcomes and probably also spiritual and mental health outcomes. But that's a different philosophy, or like, I'm going to teach you to slow down your breathing when it's fast, and then you're going to get something out of that. So, what are you trying to get people to do to learn to be with not knowing and really value sensory exploration? Or do you want to teach them something else that they can know that will it's not like snake oil, like it will actually help them relax and calm down? Mm-hmm. And depending on that goal, you're going to design a really different model. It might, right? Probably more feedback if you want to get like a relaxation outcome or something like that, I would argue.
Yeah. Definitely makes sense. So in the context of the work I'm doing, I'm trying to administer these interventions to college students to reduce anxiety overall. So what you were saying with different goals of different types of interventions, could that be something along the lines of, okay, someone's like about to have an anxiety attack, let's try to do something with their breathing to kind of do something just in time, versus every day, okay, let's do like a little mindfulness session to kind of be more aware generally in life.
Mhm. It might surprise you a bit. I would suggest if this is someone who has a history of panic, that maybe you don't start with the breath, because part of what's feeding into their anxiety or panic, like they're having an attack, as you say, is that they're trying to control it and they can't. So eventually you would like them to learn to get their heart rate down and their breathing down, but that would be something that's like a practice when they're not triggered.
Exactly.
Right. And then when they are feeling something coming on, you might start off even going somewhere like away from ground zero for them. Like, what does it feel like in your finger? Like somewhere that's not conditioned, or what does it look like in another sensory modality? And then eventually, if you think like they're starting to get the skillfulness to do it, you want them to understand, like you want them to learn how to stand back from trying to control the situation, because that's what my understanding is, that's what feeds into the attack. Is I need to control the signal. I'm anxious now, not just about the signal, but about my inability to control the signal. And now and my body's responding to that, and now it's getting worse. And I'm like, it's my self-fulfilling prophecy. So teaching people that they can master and have some control over their breathing, even with feedback, I think would be a super valuable skill to help them have more confidence with engaging. But part of it, I think, would still, I'm speaking a bit outside of my expertise, but I think you'd still want them to learn to value just like noticing what it's like to feel like you're having the attack, and like what is the condition that goes with that, and don't try to modify it until you really kind of understand what's going on there. And maybe if you can sit with that exploratory kind of view, you might realize that the attack doesn't have as much potency as when you're really resisting it. So, but it's empirical question, right? Like it's the kind of thing where that's something you could manipulate. What if you train some people to value observing and discovery, and you train other people to value parasympathetic activation, right? And you teach a slowing down or like extended out breath kind of practice to one group versus insight, like monitoring practice to another group. You could get your robots to start seeing what helps people, and you could even be sensitive to the fact that you might have subgroups where like some people really to benefit from one type of intervention versus another, and how do you characterize those people and predict who should get what training? Like I think that's the more like nuanced, realistic game. But these are really cool questions. I'm glad you're working on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We are getting to 1:30, and there's only one last question, and it's kind of related to the domain that you were just exploring. So I think you can probably kind of just continue it on. Hua Wen was asking, how do you go about breathing training for people with anxiety versus depression? Any difference in the provision of service recommended? And I think it's really a kind of a slight expansion of exactly what you were just discussing.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you everyone who's jumping out now for attending. Yeah, great question. So most of my practice, my training is on the depression side. The problem there is, but I do see them as really closely related disorders to oversimplify, right? Like they're both disorders of like this kind of neurotic reactivity tendency to go into cognitive elaboration that's really negative, and depression is past focused and anxiety is future focused. So if even with that distinction you can explain a lot of the symptom differences between them. Of course, I'm sure there's more differences than that, but in terms of what you would prescribe to someone with depression versus anxiety, I don't know if it's exactly the way I would try to go ahead to decide it, because in depression, for instance, a lot of people are melancholic and they feel like flooded by emotion, and then you have a lot of people who are anhedonic and they feel like they are somehow dissociated or separated from their emotional experience. And I would want to give them tools to navigate both of those problems. And so in anxiety, you could be so much wrapped in your head with worry that you feel numb and there's no joy. Like you could have an anhedonic quality, though it's not often a central characteristic of anxiety, or you could have like pervasive worry leading to like these fight or flight responses. I think for melancholic kind of depression where it's like too much worry, stuff like it might be a bit more similar to anxiety. And I'm just speculating right now. And these are situations where you might want someone to learn to like ride the wave of their thoughts or emotional experiences and let them sort of extinguish in kind of this sort of homeostatic process, more so than you might want to with someone who's like really anhedonic or like feels like really dissociated, want to start to explore like from the outside in, just rebuilding, sensory integration. So how does that practically shift with like talking about paying attention to the breath? I think for someone with depression, it could be just a sense of like reconnecting, like re-engaging with sensation, with monitoring and noticing like the thoughts and stuff that are coming up, but learning not to reward those thoughts by giving them your attention and learning to get some power and coming back to the sensory qualities. Like for someone where it's an overactive default mode network is sort of the way I've been trying to characterize, and that's what you think is going on. It's like they know too much about the world or what might happen or what has happened, and it's not giving them any peace. Learn to turn away from that and really value sensation as an alternative instead of just resisting the cognitive elaboration is what I would recommend. And I would be sensitive that there might be subgroups of people where that's not the problem. The problem is the absence of like any kind of representation for them that leaves them just feeling like numb. And in those cases, I might suggest that you are going to try to actually get them to do things that are a bit more like applied, maybe savoring practices. You can read a lot about savoring if you read like Eric Garland's like more like mindful oriented recovery enhancement, where you actually try to set up situations where you try to attach affective qualities. You try to condition sensory experience because it's the absence of conditioning that's actually their problem. And we're just trying to get to people at that middle ground where like they have the right balance of conditioned associations and the ability to take in new sensory information. And I think anxiety and depression can both present, and most of the time it's too much conditioning, but sometimes it's not enough. So yeah, sorry I could give you like a great like here's how you do it differently for depression or anxiety. I think just standard mindfulness training will help in most cases for depression and anxiety, and you want to be careful for that subset of people who are actually suffering from the opposite extreme of having not enough skill for adaptive or positive conditioning, and maybe try to structure some interventions directly towards building up like that sense of joy or playfulness or fun or connection or savoring for them, rather than worry too much about like you need a separate model for depression than anxiety. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Sorry, I was sort of rambling a bit there, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say one thought I have on the matter is just that the power of breath control, which can be utilized to, as you were saying, immediately experience relaxation or activation when you speed up the breath and do the kind of hyperventilating of holotropic breath work or other forms of Kundalini yoga with this fast breath of fire, they call it. Mm-hmm. Both of them give access to, the kind of immediate sensations of the body changing dramatically and in ways that can either be enlivening or awakening or deeply relaxing. And while I think from a mindfulness perspective, it can be very dangerous to kind of focus just on that, and kind of giving people tools to manipulate their experience is not going to necessarily help grow the capacity for this non-reactive, judgmental, clear awareness. That having both skills does also seem really valid, kind of, benefit to both. And so, for those with anxiety, the kind of learning of that deep and slow breathing could be even more kind of valuable than some with depression, although the kind of distinction is, I would also agree, a little artificial given the intermixing of these kind of symptoms.
Yeah, that's a great way to finish is, like what is the intention? And then like, let's find practices that fulfill those intentions. And as opposed to being like, oh, you found a practice to match your intention, but it wasn't the intention I thought you should hold or something like that. Or yeah. So yeah, it's a great point, Raul.
Well, thank you once again, Norm, for sharing all of your hard-earned knowledge and wisdom with us. And, we really appreciate everyone for tuning in. Stay tuned for our next one. Thanks again. Take care.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for inviting me, and be well, everyone. Take care. Thanks, Helen. Okay, see you.
See you.